If it feels like the LinkedIn algorithm is constantly punishing you, I want to show you the exact strategies that I've used personally and across more than 50 accounts to make posts consistently go viral on LinkedIn. For example, this post absolutely blew up. And here's a really small LinkedIn account. Their post never got more than 1,000 to 2,000 impressions per post. But after applying what I'm showing you today, now their account's getting more than 250,000 impressions per week, and more importantly, generating millions in pipeline. So what this means for you is that if you feel like your LinkedIn is a bit stuck, by the end of this video, you'll have the exact steps that you need to take to get out of algorithm jail and instead make the algorithm love you. Now, first things first, let's talk about what the LinkedIn algorithm is actually favoring right now. LinkedIn prioritizes high quality, professional, and actionable content. So people are actually on LinkedIn to learn about their profession, learn about business. LinkedIn is unique in that this is why people use the platform. Now, engagement signals like likes, comments, shares are critical for visibility, especially early on. So when you post something, those first 30 to 60 minutes are so important. If you post a piece of content and it doesn't get a lot of engagement in that early window, it's gonna flop. I'm also seeing that narrative and story-based content is performing really well right now. Sharing personal experiences and examples of your expertise are performing way better than your basic how-to pieces of content. And one more note, LinkedIn seems to be prioritizing video right now. They just rolled out their TikTok style video feed. When platforms roll out new features like this, they tend to incentivize them, and we're seeing this on LinkedIn. Text posts still work well, so do carousels. Generally, pairing a post with a relevant piece of media seems to be the way to go right now. And so using that information, here's what I'm actually doing right now to make sure my content gets in front of my target audience. So how do I make my content optimized to get in front of thousands of new potential customers every single day? First and foremost, you gotta prioritize your hook. If your hook is bad, your post is not gonna perform well. So many great pieces of content have been buried by the algorithm because of a bad hook. You have to get people to want to click that see more button. If you can't do that, your post is dead. Here are 3 simple ways that you can improve your hooks right now. First one, use story-based hooks. Like I said earlier, narrative content is performing really well right now. So if you can use a narrative or story-based hook, that hook is gonna be more compelling. Simple thing to remember, how I is better than how to. And here's an example of that. So in Austin's post right here, he talks about how Unify grew revenue by 24x year over year in 2024. Here's what we did every month. Instead of saying, hey, here's how to grow your startup's revenue, he's saying, hey, here's what we did. Here's the tangible result that we got, which is social proof. And here's exactly how we did it. Which hook do you think is more compelling? Second strategy here is use negativity bias. So a lot of hooks are just sterile and very safe, which means they're gonna blend in on the timeline. Think about how you can be a bit polarizing, especially with views that you believe very strongly. I'm gonna adapt Virgil Abloh's 3% rule here. So the idea is that if you improve something or change something by 3%, that's enough to make it feel new. With your hooks, and specifically negativity bias, think about how you can make your hooks 3% more polarizing. Now, here's an example from my own account. I could have just written, hey, here are the 3 reasons why founder-led content is so important right now. Not a terrible hook. You have a little bit of a curiosity gap because of the listicle framing, but it's not that compelling and it's not a unique opinion to me. Instead, what I wrote was day 67 of distributing founder-led content propaganda. Founders who decide to start publishing on LinkedIn in 2025 will have a competitive advantage. Notice how it's still the same idea. I'm still trying to communicate why founder-led content is important, but I'm making a little bit more spicy. I'm not going full extremist. Again, you don't need to do that, but how can you make it a little bit more polarizing? Third hook writing improvement, use specific numbers in your post, specifically revenue numbers, monetary figures, growth numbers, things that inspire social proof in the reader that make them trust you. So for example, Alex Hormozi in his content will often talk about how he sold Gym Launch for $46 million. Why he's including that is because that specific number and specific monetary figure inspires social proof and gives his audience a reason to trust him. Now, second theme here to make the LinkedIn algorithm love you is to include relevant media in your content. And this media doesn't have to be short form video. LinkedIn is going pretty hard in that direction right now. They just rolled out their short form video feed, like I said. So you can take advantage of it, but don't bet the farm on LinkedIn short form video just yet. Regular images and carousels are still doing well. The main takeaway is that the media needs to support whatever you're talking about in your copy. So whether that's a video, whether it's a carousel, whether it's an in real life photo, it just needs to be relevant to the post copy. And if you've been struggling to figure out how to work media into your content or how to just acquire pieces of media that you can use in your content, here are 3 plays that you can implement right now. First is build a library of in real life photos. So generally we see if you're going to use a still image, just regular photos from like team events, customer events, your previous experiences, like your old job or whatever, tend to work better than like branded graphics or infographics in a lot of cases. Infographics can crush when they're done well, but a lot of times folks will just put these branded graphics in their content that make the content look like an ad, whereas real life photos tend to make it look scrappier, more authentic, more organic, and the content overall tends to perform better. Second way to include media in your content is include 1 carousel per week. You can do more than 1, but I would just test 1 per week to see if it's a format that performs well for your audience. So what I like to do and what often performs well for me is listicle style content tends to perform really well as a carousel, and it's a super easy carousel to make. So making a narrative narrative or story-based piece of content as a carousel is doable, but it's harder. If you have a list of 15 tips to X, Y, or Z, just turn that into a carousel. Each slide is one of those tips and it'll perform really well. And third, I'd recommend testing one short form video a week. You don't need to go all in here, like I said, but I'd recommend testing it, especially if you're half decent on camera. So if you can sit here like I am right now and talk to a camera, not super cinematic, you don't need to do a daily vlog, just sit there, talk to a camera, share value, that content will perform really well on LinkedIn. And here's an example of what that would look like. I use a green screen on this one. You don't need to use the green screen effect. It can work pretty well as a way to add visuals without a whole lot of editing, but simple talking head will get the job done for you. Now, the third way to make the LinkedIn algorithm love you is to use narrative in your content. I've mentioned it a few times, but LinkedIn is really rewarding story-based content. This is true across social platforms, not just LinkedIn. And I see so many founders share what they think is valuable content, but it gets zero traction because the framing is just super unoriginal and generic. That generic how-to content is out. Like AI is driving the value of that style of content to zero. If you don't have unique stories and anecdotes that you can apply to your own content, you're just gonna blend in and AI can pretty much do the same thing. And now adding narrative to your content can feel a bit overwhelming. A lot of other content styles like listicles and hot takes tend to be pretty straightforward, but telling stories is hard. It's a skill that many people spend their entire life trying to develop. But as a starting point, here are 3 easy ways that you can add narrative to your content without it feeling super forced or overwhelming. First, use customer conversation content. You're always talking to customers. If you're a founder, you're always talking to customers every day, every week. If you're not, then you probably shouldn't be a founder and I'd be concerned for your company. The good thing is those customer conversations are a goldmine for content. If a customer has an objection or they run into an issue that you help them solve, or they just say something interesting that's like a trend that you're seeing in the industry right now, you can take all those things and turn them into pieces of content and frame them around, hey, I was talking to this customer and they said this thing, or I was talking to this prospect and they had this objection. So here's an example of customer conversation content that I did. Last week, I was talking to a founder who just raised a Series A and they had one big problem with LinkedIn content. They had a ton of great ideas, but no time. Recruiting, customer calls, etc., all took priority. I call this calendar creep. Here's how to fix it. So notice how the post itself is actually pretty standard. It's just your typical framework post, but I used a narrative in the hook, like I mentioned earlier, to add that story-based flair to it and make it unique. So I was having this conversation. Here's what I learned. The second way to add narrative to your content is use career expertise content. So oftentimes, if you're a founder, you have expertise previously in your career that led you to start this specific company. Those anecdotes and those stories can turn into great LinkedIn content. Here's an example of this career expertise content that I like from Diana Ross. So she writes, in less than 10 years, I've taken startups from $0 to $10 million in ARR twice as the only salesperson. And I'm doing it for a third time with RB2B. Here are the 8 biggest pieces of advice that I give to anybody in startup sales. So notice how it's not just, hey, here are 8 tips for how to succeed in startup sales. Instead, she says, hey, I built these companies to $10 million in revenue, which is a very compelling, specific number hook, like I talked about earlier, that catches the attention of someone in startups and in sales. And then she transitions into the 8 tips. So think about how you can use your previous experiences. Everything you've done in your career, all the accomplishments, all the failures and mess ups, all of that stuff is great material for content. And the third specific way to include narrative in your content is to do what I call an origin story post. This is a specific post step that we see works really well for every one of our clients. What was the light bulb moment? What triggered you to start your company? Likely there's some sort of adversity or problem you had to overcome. Include that in the story because stories are made by conflict. If you don't have conflict or adversity in your story, it's not really compelling. So here's an example I like from David where he tells the story of how he founded Fondo, his current company, and the adversity that he went through. So notice that he starts with, hey, in 2019, my YC startup was about to miss payroll. That immediately introduces stakes into the story and conflict into the story, which engages the reader. And on this topic of narrative-based content, a really simple framework I want you to keep in mind is what I call the Google Calendar method. So every single week on Friday, go back and look at your Google Calendar, or whatever calendar app you use, and look at the meetings that you had. And notice if any jump out to you. Was there a specific 1 to 2 meetings or 2 to 3 meetings that stood out to you where someone said something interesting? Maybe you got into a little bit of a disagreement with someone. There's something cool happened in one of those meetings that can turn into a piece of content. And like I said earlier, you're always talking to customers, you're always talking to prospects, you're always talking to your team. And as long as you're doing that, there's endless material for content. I like to block off like 20 minutes on Friday morning, same time that I go through and update my CRM, update my sales data, the rest of the data I need to update. I'll go through and look at my calendar and see if there are any stories that stood out from the previous week. Alex Ramosi, who I mentioned earlier, also mentioned that he keeps a spreadsheet of hundreds of stories that occurred in his life that he can then use as anecdotes and content. So you don't want to make yourself remember everything from scratch because you're going to forget stuff. That's normal. So if you have a way to keep track of stories, you can make this use of narrative content, which is really performing well right now on LinkedIn, so much easier. A bonus tip here is commenting on other people's content. So in addition to posting great content and applying the strategy we just talked about, you also want to leave leave thoughtful comments on other people's content. There are two types of accounts you want to comment on. One is ICP accounts, ideal customer profile, people that might eventually buy from you. You want to just comment on their post to get in front of them. The second and more compelling, in my opinion, is the ICP influencer account. So what influencers and thought leaders in your category is your ICP following on LinkedIn? You want to comment on their content because one, you're just going to get in front of your ICP because they're going to be in their comments too. They're going to see your stuff. And if it's engaging, they'll likely go to your profile. Second is what'll often happen is when you comment on these accounts, they'll often return the favor and you'll start to build this relationship where, hey, you're commenting on their content, they're commenting on yours, your content is getting boosted. Like I mentioned earlier, early engagement matters on content. So the more that you can get people to comment and engage on your own stuff, the better off you're going to be. And one way to initiate that is by going and commenting on other people's content. Now, once you implement all that, the algorithm is going to absolutely love you, but there's a lot more to learn if you're just getting started on LinkedIn. And if I was starting from scratch and wanted to get back to 35,000 followers ASAP, there are 3 specific things that I would implement right away. So check out the next video where I break down those 3 key concepts that you could use in your own LinkedIn content strategy to grow, even if you're starting from scratch. So you can leverage LinkedIn content to cement yourself as an authority in your category and ultimately grow your business. I'll see you over there.